Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. When I was 8 years old, my family lived in a house that never really felt normal. Even now, when I think back on it, the word that comes to mind is strange. It was big, older, and sat right on the edge of a small town, far enough away that it felt isolated, but still close enough that you could see other houses in the distance. It wasn't the kind of place that felt warm or comforting. It had long hallways, odd corners, and rooms that always felt darker than they should have, even during the day. At that time, the local school district was going through a major restructuring. Boundaries were changing, schools were being reassigned, and nothing was very consistent. Because of this, even though my brother and I were only a couple of grades apart, we ended up going to different schools. That also meant we took different buses, with different schedules. My brother's bus came later in the morning and dropped him off later in the afternoon. Mine came earlier both ways. Because of that, I was the last person to leave the house every morning and the first person to come home every afternoon. That responsibility fell on me simply because of timing, even though I was just a kid. My parents made it clear that since I was the last one out, it was my job to make sure the house was locked up. Every morning before leaving, I had to walk through the house, turn off lights, check doors, and lock the front door behind me. It made me feel grown up at first, like I had an important job. But it also meant I spent a lot of time alone in that house, and that feeling slowly became uncomfortable. One morning, while doing my usual routine, I noticed something odd. The basement door was open and the light inside the basement was on. This immediately stood out to me because no one ever went into the basement in the mornings. The basement wasn't a place we used often. It was unfinished, dark, and mostly used for storage. I remember pausing for a moment at the top of the stairs, feeling uneasy, but telling myself there was a logical explanation. I went down just enough to reach the light switch, turned it off, and closed the basement door. I didn't think much more about it after that. I locked the front door and left for school. That afternoon, when my bus dropped me off and I walked back into the house, the first thing I noticed was the same thing I had seen that morning. The basement door was open again, and the light was on. At first, I brushed it off. I assumed I must have been mistaken earlier. Maybe I hadn't really turned the light off. Maybe I hadn't fully closed the door. I was 8 years old, after all, and it was easy to believe I had simply forgotten. So I walked over to the basement door again, intending to do the same thing I had done that morning. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down. That was when I saw it. At the bottom of the staircase, standing in the shadows, was a large male figure. I couldn't make out details like facial features or clothing. It was mostly a dark shape, but it was clearly human. Tall, broad, solid. It wasn't something my imagination could easily explain away as a trick of the light. The moment felt frozen. My brain couldn't fully process what my eyes were seeing. Then fear hit me all at once. I slammed the basement door shut as hard as I could. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the handle. I dragged boxes, storage bins, anything I could find, and shoved them against the door to block it. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was acting purely on instinct. After that, I ran. I ran to my bedroom and hid in my closet, curling up as small as I could. I stayed there for hours, barely breathing, convinced that if I made a sound, something terrible would happen. Every noise in the house made my heart pound. The sound of the walls settling, the hum of appliances, even distant traffic felt like footsteps coming closer. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. For months, I kept it to myself. I was absolutely certain that what I had seen was a ghost. That was the only explanation my 8-year-old mind could come up with, and I was just as certain that no one would believe me. I didn't want to be laughed at or told I was imagining things, so I stayed quiet. Life went on, but I was never comfortable in that house again. I rushed through my morning routines. I hated being alone there. I avoided the basement completely. Even walking past the door made my stomach twist. Still, I never said a word. About a year later, strange things started happening. My mom and her boyfriend began to notice that small amounts of money were going missing. At first, they thought it was simple forgetfulness. A few dollars misplaced here and there didn't seem like a big deal. But as time went on, the pattern became harder to ignore. The amounts were always small, never more than $60 at a time. But it kept happening. Over several months, it added up to somewhere between $800 and $900. That was a lot of money for our family. They searched the house, trying to figure out how it could be happening. No doors were broken. No windows showed signs of forced entry. Nothing else was disturbed. Just the money. One evening, they decided to do a full inspection of the house. We all grabbed flashlights and started looking everywhere. Closets, attics, under furniture, behind storage boxes. Eventually, someone checked the outside of the house more carefully. That's when they found it. There was a small hole on the exterior of the house, partially hidden and easy to miss. It led into a crawl space beneath the house. From there, someone could squeeze through, move through the crawl space, and then access the basement from inside. That was how he was getting in. Some stranger had been climbing into our house, crawling through tight spaces and coming up through the basement. He had been living off our money, taking small amounts at a time so it wouldn't be noticed right away. When my mom and her boyfriend realized this, the truth hit me all at once. What I had seen that day wasn't a ghost. It was him. The shadowy figure at the bottom of the basement stairs was a real person. A man who had been inside our house without us knowing. A man who had been watching, waiting, and stealing. The realization made me feel sick. I finally told my family what I had seen a year earlier. As I spoke, I could see the horror spread across their faces. They understood immediately what it meant. I had been alone in the house with him, at least once, possibly more times than that. That moment was one of the most terrifying of my life, even more than the day I had slammed the basement door shut. The fear wasn't imagined anymore. It was real. It had a face, even if I never saw it clearly. We contacted the authorities. The hole was sealed. The house was secured. But the damage had already been done. The sense of safety was gone. Even now, years later, I still think about that house. About being 8 years old and standing at the top of those basement stairs. About how close I came to something far worse than I ever understood at the time. What scares me most isn't the memory of the shadow. It's the realization of how vulnerable I was and how easily something terrible could have happened without anyone knowing. I live in a stretch of Kentucky that feels like the earth remembers older rules. The roads narrow and curl like old scars. The trees grow close enough to hush a conversation. On the map, there was a thick cluster of red dots right in my county. They sat on top of a small, neglected cavern system called the Blackwood Sinkholes. It wasn't some glossy tourist cave with electric walkways and an Instagram account. It was a jagged wound in the woods, a place the locals avoided without agreeing to explain why. I showed the map to Jess because she'd laugh at me if I kept staring at it alone. Jess is the kind of woman who owns multiple kinds of hiking boots, who names trails like old friends and eats protein bars like relics. I am not that person. I read unsolved cases until my eyes go gritty and spend Sundays in the kind of pajamas that declare bankruptcy in the fashion world. It lines up, I said, pointing at the screen. Look, People keep vanishing where the sinkholes are. Maybe they fall, maybe they get lost, or maybe something down there wants people. She rolled her eyes the way you roll your eyes at a campfire ghost story, but her smile said she was in. You want to go ghost hunting, or are you going to try to prove everyone wrong? Debunking, I said, because I like the sound of being rational in the face of nonsense. We packed the Jeep Friday, tents, sleeping bags, a pile of firewood, 2 folding chairs, and a cooler full of ribs I'd marinated for 48 hours. I insisted on real bourbon because cheap whiskey makes you poetic, and we needed the sort of courage that goes with butchering a bottle. The hike in was worse than either of us expected. The trail dropped away from the logging road into a clotted green that grabbed your ankles and tried to keep you. The trees here grew with bent purpose, roots exposed like old hands. When we found the cave mouth, it looked almost human, an open mouth carved in limestone, dark and patient. Cold air spilled out of the hole like breath too old to be warm. It smelled like wet stone and something metallic under it, copper or old coins. We set up camp 50 yards from the entrance, because you don't put a tent right next to an open, dark thing unless you like obsolete decisions. We built the fire and set the grill over it, and the smoke rolled low across the ground. The ribs stuck to the grate gloriously, the sauce bubbling and caramelizing. For a while, we ate like people who trusted that the rest of the world would keep going whether we stayed or left. Jess laughed about a guy who tripped over his own marshmallow stick. I nodded, and the laugh in my chest felt real. Then the woods stopped being noisy. The insects fell silent. The wind folded. When things get very quiet in nature, it doesn't mean calm. It means attention. The silence pressed in like a hand over our mouths. I remember Jess going still and saying, "Do you hear that?" As if the question itself might break whatever was listening. The cave made a sound then, deep and long, a moan that could be written off as wind if you were on a hiking blog and trying to sound brave. It wasn't wind. It was the cave itself, inhaling and exhaling, like lungs that had been closed for a long time and were tired of staying that way. Something scraped inside like grit under a tongue. Then the sound became retching, deep, wet, the sort of coughing that suggests something is trying to drag itself back up from the dark. It warped into a whispering voice. "Come," it said, but it wasn't a clear invitation. It was a grinding of stones together in a rhythm that your brain wanted to turn into syllables. Jess grabbed the grill lid like a shield. "We leave," she said. Her voice wasn't shaky. We both sound better in command when the world is falling apart. I grabbed the hatchet I'd used for splitting wood because there are pieces of metal, however small, that make you feel like someone expects you to be dangerous. The smell hit us before we could see them. Old meat and sweet rot, a stink that draped itself over your shoulders and sat there like an accusation. Then shapes untangled from the cave. They were wrong in the way of nightmares that have studied you and learned your favorite ways to panic. Imagine the outline of a person stretched too far, joints angling where joints shouldn't, a limb bending like bad wiring. Their skin was sallow, silvered with old lotion, but it glistened with wetness like grease. Their faces were too long, mouths pulled back into grins that might be teeth or might be something they've sewn on with confidence. Their eyes were cloudy as if someone had painted them over. 3 of them crawled out at first. 2 slid on all fours with too many elbows. The 3rd limped forward with a movement like an insect unlearning how to walk. They went straight for the grill like they'd been invited to a banquet. One of them grabbed the searing metal with a hand that looked like a child's channeling an old witch. Flesh shriveled and popped against the grate, and it didn't scream. It licked the grease with a tongue that was blackened and long. The thing made a sound part chitter, part purr, the universe misreading pleasure. They weren't hunting us, they were feeding. They even seemed to savor it, which is worse. predators that savor you are the ones who remember you. I yanked the trash bag of bones at instinct, because we carry gross things into the woods, and sometimes that's the price of being alive. The bag slapped one of them and burst. Ribs and paper towels scattered across the dirt. The creature dove, not toward us now, but into the ribs, teeth closing like the tap of nutcracker. The sound of bone breaking, sharp, brittle, was obscene under the quiet. That pause was the moment the world decided I wasn't a character in a clean ghost story. We ran because running is a human thing, bad at first but then automatic. The woods closed a million hands on us. Roots, low, branches, thorny vines, my shirt tore, Jess's leggings snagged. We fell down, got up, and fell again. A choreography of panic. Behind us, the things were fast. Their movement wasn't bound by the steps we know. They didn't crunch through leaves so much as slide over them like an idea. Their emission of noise changed as they closed distance. First, a shriek that sounded like something being unstitched. Then a keening that borrowed the cadence of a child wail and rewired it into hatred. One hit the rear of the Jeep with a force that made glass tremble. It dented like an animal marking territory. We slammed the locks, and the world took a breath of time where our hearts tried to jump out through our ribs. On the way back to town, the radio made static like a face trying to talk. We agreed on a story: cougar, bear, weird raccoon, and told friends we just got spooked. We were lying to everyone except ourselves, because I kept going back to the map. The dots clustered at holidays. Holidays where people left their houses, lit fires, burned meat over open flames. The sinkholes weren't accidents. They were vents. They were mouths. They were receivers. After a few days, I started to notice things at the edges of myself. A fondness for the smell of charred meat I hadn't had before. My dreams thick with low groaning, a memory of the black tongue near my face. I couldn't say if it was fear making me notice or if it was something else grooming me to notice. The town had missing person reports that went back decades, the sort of papers that gather like cobwebs until the web stops being a metaphor and starts being a thing. The first time I went back to the sinkholes, I thought I'd finally be clever enough to prove it wrong. I took better gear. I took light that could blind a small god. I took rope, packs, an anchor, and a voice recorder, because modern bravado keeps receipts. I wanted to map the place, find the ventilation shafts they talk about in engineering textbooks where wind goes down and fresher air pulls up. Instead, I found little things that suggested the creatures fed in a system human eyes had never built for them. Soot that wasn't from any human fire, small tubes of waxy substance anchored to rock like combs, and bone fragments too worn to be from the diet of any forest scavenger. On the third visit, I found a footprint. It wasn't quite a print, and it wasn't quite nothing. The ground around the sinkhole had a ring worn deep as a bowl. There were scrape marks that suggested something with too many knuckles had dug, like a fisherman learning to dig for bait. But there were also other marks, patterns, almost glyphs traced into stone, as if someone had tried to scratch phrases into the world. Some of them were spiral loops. Others looked like parabolas. I pressed my gloved fingertips to one, because people do stupid tactile things to a place that feels dangerous, and a cold little shock ran up my arm like an apology. The marks were older than rust, older than our concept of old. You could write a theory that the sinkholes connected to caverns far below, spaces where sunlight is an invention people make up when daylight is missing too long. The idea that a colony of something adapted to living between drafts and stone would learn to attune itself to the smoke and smell of cooking human flesh is nothing short of efficient. Humans make a lot of meat, and we put our fires out in the evening. We are, in a way, the alarm that tells the creatures to come. But lore needs more than logic to be terrifying. It needs a face. It needs rules. so I kept looking because I want to know how to avoid being an idiot again. The rules revealed themselves slowly, like frost. The creatures emerged when smoke bent toward the vents. They could sense 100 different molecules in air: burnt sugar, saturated oil, charcoal smoke, even the microscopic salts of human sweat. They weren't interested in you if you were raw and running. They were interested in the dressing, sauce and smoke and the sound of slow cooking. Holidays meant grills. Grills meant ribs. Ribs meant bones. Bones meant something to crunch on. They didn't run toward light. They ran toward smell. They lured sometimes with a cracked whisper that sounded like syllables arranged by a person learning to mimic the shape of human speech. Sometimes the voice came wrapped in a storm of static and a melody so small your ears tried to refuse it. Once I heard it, late one night at my kitchen table. There was a cadence I couldn't shake. It slid into a sentence like grease into a pan. Come feed us. You can be civilized and want explanation. That doesn't mean you're safe. One night I crafted the kind of foolish plan a man tells himself is research. I took a brisket heavy with rub and attached a recorder to it like a farmer making a trap. I filled a thermos with embers, hidden in meat smell and heat, and set it down just off the trail. I concealed myself 60 yards away with a camera. At 2:14 a.m., the camera caught motion. I watched the footage and made the slow growl of the first thing I saw, an audible thing in my bones. The thing that came for the meat didn't move as an animal, but as a suggestion of an animal. It had an elongated neck that bent like an old antenna. Its hands were wrong, more instruments than limbs. It bit the meat once, and there was no sound of pain or warmth. Bones crumpled under teeth which looked like a child's idea of teeth. Too many, too small, all used. After it fed, it turned and looked almost at the camera. For a long second, the camera recorded something like recognition. Then it placed its palm flat against the lens. The screen registered oil and 5 black streaks shaped like the shadow of a hand. The video was corrupted in the spots where the palm pressed. The file refused to play the frames cleanly. You could see movement, then nothing, then movement again. As if whatever touched the camera took with it a small piece of time. I took that file to people I trusted. An engineer said atmospheric interference and sensors and cheap plastic lenses. But his voice had the tired quality of a man who will never again believe in a simple answer. The more I talked about it, the more people slid away until the only one who came back to the sinkholes was Jess. We thought ourselves prepared the night we brought a smoker, turned it into a deliberate banquet, and left it as bait. We put marks in the trees to show our route. We put reflective banding. I wrote each other's names on our arms with ink because some stories are cowardly rituals in their own right. We did everything you do when you try to simulate bravery. The smoker smoked. The smell threaded the woods like a ribbon, and the air changed, like a throat clearing. We sat hunkered down in our backs against a hollowed-out log, breath loud enough to be a drum. When they came this time, it wasn't in a crawl. They arrived in a wave that made my bones clench. This time there were more of them than before, and they behaved with a sort of organized hunger. They didn't simply dive into the meat. They tore, they picked. They tore the skin of the meat from fissures, and then they did something worse. They began to feed on the fat and the muscle with a kind of ecclesiastical reverence, their heads bowing in ways that were both prayer and ritual. One of them took a bone and scraped the marrow out, lining its fingers with it, then pressed that marrow onto the stone like an offering. Another reached up at the tongue of smoke like tasting it. The sound they made as they ate was a layered thing. Crunch and slurp and a whispered melody threaded through it like liturgy. When they weren't eating, they clicked their tongues together in a pattern that had cadence and emphasis, as if they were counting. Their skin had turned gray with ash in places where meat had spat grease, and their eyes reflected the fire like black marbles. In the smoke, I saw them make a slow circle, a motion that felt like counting off souls. They noticed Jess. They noticed me. Not immediately, they smelled us, and then arranged a shape in the dark that pointed their faces our way. One cocked its head, and there was that mimicry again, a partial syllable that sounded like boy or come or whatever your brain wanted to hear. Jess whispered, "Move," and I moved because that's what you do when the thing in the dark has learned the sound of your voice. We ran. As we broke from the log, it felt different from previous flights. The creatures didn't chase the way animals chase. They pursued with a still, patient inevitability. At one point, something slammed into Jess's shoulder and tore the jacket fabric straight through her skin. I felt the weight of her, and I felt a cold under my ribs where the breath can no longer hold up a life. She didn't scream. Blood came out like motor oil and more like a mapping of weakness. The smell of iron in the air slapped me stupid. She fell between two roots, and the thing bent over her with too much tenderness. It smelled her like a connoisseur. It lifted her face, and I saw at once that what it wanted wasn't just flesh for chewing. It wanted the sounds that flex from a living throat. It pressed its ruined mouth to her ear, and there was a wet sound like words being rearranged in someone else's mouth. I am only brave for a second. I am only brave until the thing is by her face, and the world is narrow and hard, and focused on the wet music beside me. I grabbed at it. I stabbed with the hatchet. The head split like rotten fruit. Blood, thicker and darker than human blood, spattered my gloves and my face. The thing lurched, and a high keening rose up, a note so thin it cut my lungs. It wasn't animal pain, but a rupture of something cosmic. The creature convulsed, and its insides gave up a smell that explained everything and nothing. Sweetness gone wrong, the odor of ancient kitchens where dinner was offered to gods. The thing dropped Jess like leftover meat. She took a breath, and then another, and then her hand closed on mine, and she looked at me with eyes that tried and failed to be the same. She whispered, "Don't stop," in a voice that was not afraid. We left the smoker behind. We drove until the Jeep's engine sounded like a thing willing to carry guilt. We reached the town and told the story again and again, a loop you tightened to keep the truth from spilling. People asked questions. Police filed reports. Someone burned the smoking corpses later with torches until there were only bones and ash and a small black residue that would not wash from our hands. In the weeks that followed, I realized something miserable and private. I could smell the memory. Every time I passed a tailgate or a neighborhood grill, my brain found the hint of charcoal in the air and remembered the low groan of the cave. I would wake with a taste like burnt sugar in my mouth. Lore builds on bones like vines on old stone. People came to the sinkholes less when the stories started to spread. But curiosity never dies. It only becomes gorgeous in a new way. There were always people who considered danger a badge. There's something about knowledge of a thing existing that makes us think we own it. Like naming a thing means you control it. We don't. We name because naming is the human way to take inventory before we are taken. There are rules, though. They are not moral. They are mechanical. They enchant, then enforce. They like smoke, especially the kind that carries the scent of butter and sugar and char. They sense salt, sweat, and the tang of iron. They will come when you are cooking, loud and proud, because we make ourselves delicious in ways they have taught their bodies to need. If you find a sinkhole, you do not barbecue. If you must be near one, keep your fires wet, keep your smoke short. Bring bells or other small clashing things that break a melody. The creatures hate dissonance. They like rhythm and easy songs. They hate the cracked ring of metal. That last piece of advice is practical and small, and it will not save you if the thing has already learned the sound of you. My hope is selfish. I want the map to be a map to nothing for everyone else. I want to walk past the sinkholes in a life that keeps its distance. But I know maps are bad at telling people to stay home. They whisper directions, they give waypoints, they help you get closer. If you go, take earplugs for the mimicry, leave the sauce at home, and resist the urge to think yourself the exception. Some nights I listen to the clip from the camera, and I freeze on the frame where the thing's hand touches the lens. I play the recording of the hatchet and the following shriek, and I can still taste blackened sugar at the back of my throat. Once you see them up close, you can't unknow the hunger in the way they honor what they eat. They are a religion formed from the underside of things we cook. Their rituals are built from bones and smoke. The sinkholes are not simple wounds in the earth. They are mouths, waiting patiently to be fed. Holidays are the worst time. The map shows red spreads like a rash because on those days the country takes to the fields and the lawns to gild the air with the scents these things adore. When the lights go out tonight and the grills flare up in rows, when someone lets the ribs caramelize to black and passes the plate around with pride, remember the map, the sinkholes, the way the dark listens. Remember the sound that tastes like weather. Come. Remember that the world sometimes opens not to swallow you, but to be made full. Remember that we carry our own invitations, wrapped in foil and sauce and bone, and that once you cook your way into their mouths, you might never find your way back out. Before my father died, he told me a story he had never shared openly during his life. He spoke about it only once, quietly, near the end, in a way that made it clear he was not exaggerating or trying to impress anyone. He was serious, calm, and almost careful with his words. This was something he had carried with him for decades. My father served in Vietnam in the 1960s. He was part of a small American unit that worked alongside local fighters known as CIDG strikers. These were South Vietnamese villagers who had been trained to fight, guide, and scout. They knew the jungle better than anyone, and American units depended on them heavily for deep missions away from bases and supply lines. The mission he told me about involved placing seismic ground sensors along a network of jungle trails. These sensors were designed to detect movement, especially large groups of enemy soldiers moving through the area. It was quiet work, slow and careful, and very dangerous. These missions often took days and involved moving deep into hostile territory with very little support. According to my father, the team consisted of 2 Americans and 5 CIDG strikers. They had already been in the jungle for about 2 days when this particular incident happened. By that point, they were tired, hungry, and constantly alert. The jungle never really let you relax. Even when nothing was happening, you were always listening, watching, waiting. On that day, the group reached a point where several narrow jungle trails crossed each other. It was the kind of place enemy units often used to move supplies or troops. The main group decided to continue placing sensors further away, but my father and 2 of the strikers split off to watch a nearby trail intersection for a while. The plan was simple: observe, listen, and decide whether it was safe to move farther down the trail or whether they should turn back and rejoin the others. They took up hidden positions in thick brush near the intersection. My father said the jungle felt unusually quiet that day. Not silent, but calm. There were birds calling, insects buzzing, and once in a while the sound of monkeys moving through the trees. No gunfire, no distant explosions, no signs of enemy movement, just the jungle being the jungle. They stayed there for several hours, maybe 3 or 4. Time moved strangely in those moments. Minutes felt long and hours blended together. They watched the trails carefully, scanning for movement, listening for footsteps or voices. Nothing happened. Eventually, they began to talk quietly among themselves, deciding what to do next. They agreed it might be best to move a little farther down the trail before heading back. before stepping out of the cover of the brush, my father did what he always did. He checked the trail one last time. He looked carefully at the ground, the tree line, the shadows. He signaled to his men to get ready but to stay still until he gave the word. As he leaned forward and prepared to step onto the trail, something caught his eye. Lying along the edge of the trail, just short of the intersection, was a soldier. Not a Vietnamese soldier, not an American soldier. My father said his first thought was confusion. The man looked out of place in a way that was hard to explain. He was a light-skinned black man wearing what appeared to be an old-style military uniform. Not modern fatigues, not anything from the 1960s. The uniform looked like something from another era entirely. The soldier was fully equipped. He had 2 pistols, one on each side. He carried a Spencer rifle, the kind used during the American Civil War. At his hip was a short, curved club that my father immediately recognized as a Native American war club. For a moment, my father thought he must be hallucinating. Fatigue, stress, dehydration, those things could do strange things to the mind. But the soldier was too clear, too detailed. The gear was real. The posture was relaxed but alert, like someone who knew exactly where he was and why. Then the soldier turned his head and looked directly at my father. My father told me that what stayed with him most was the smile. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't strange. It was calm and familiar, almost reassuring. The soldier raised one finger and gently placed it to his lips, signaling for silence. Then he motioned with his hand, telling my father to move back into the jungle and away from the trail. My father didn't argue. He didn't question it. Training took over, but so did instinct. He slowly signaled to the 2 strikers to remain hidden. He eased himself back into the brush on his side of the trail, careful not to make a sound. As he moved, he noticed something that still gives me chills when I think about it. The soldier did the same thing on the opposite side of the trail. He slipped back into the jungle, mirroring my father's movement, as if they were part of the same unit, working together without a word spoken. Less than 10 seconds later, everything made sense. From the far end of the trail, enemy soldiers appeared. The lead element of a North Vietnamese army unit walked straight through the intersection. They were close, maybe 30 feet away. My father said they moved with discipline and confidence, weapons ready but not raised. More kept coming, dozens of them. He estimated there were at least 70, maybe 80 soldiers in total. They were heavily armed, automatic rifles, light machine guns, rocket-propelled grenade launchers. A force that large would have torn through my father's small team in seconds if they had stepped onto the trail. My father and the 2 strikers remained perfectly still. They didn't breathe louder than the jungle itself. The enemy soldiers passed through the intersection without ever knowing they had nearly walked into an ambush, or that they had nearly ambushed someone else. After what felt like forever, the last of the enemy soldiers disappeared down the trail. Father didn't see the Union soldier again. As soon as it was safe, my father and his men quietly pulled back and moved as fast as they could without making noise. They rejoined the rest of the patrol and reported the enemy movement they had observed. Command needed to know about a force that size moving through the area, but my father did not mention the soldier, not to his unit, not to his superiors, not to his friends. He kept that part to himself. He told me that in the military, especially during wartime, there were things you learned not to say out loud. Some experiences didn't fit into reports or after-action briefings. Some things, if spoken, would only bring questions you couldn't answer. He carried that secret for many years. The only person he told before me was his grandmother. He told her in the 1970s when she was on her deathbed. He described the soldier exactly as he had seen him, the uniform, the weapons, the smile. According to my father, his grandmother smiled softly when he finished. She didn't open her eyes. She didn't ask questions. She simply said, "You saw old Red Tom." Red Tom, she explained, was his great-great-grandfather. Red Tom was a free man, half black and half Creek, living long before my father was born. During the American Civil War, he served as a scout for the Union Army. He knew the land, knew how to move unseen, and knew how to warn others of danger. Later, he served with the U.S. Cavalry in the American West. He was known for carrying 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle, and a Creek war club into battle, the same weapons my father had seen in Vietnam. After telling me this story, my father never spoke of it again. He didn't ask me to believe it. He didn't try to explain it. He simply told me what happened, the way it happened, and left it at that. I've thought about that story many times since his passing. I don't know what it means. I don't know how to explain it, but I know my father. He was not a man who made things up. He didn't chase mystery or fantasy. He believed in facts, discipline, and reality. And yet, in the middle of a jungle halfway across the world, during a war fought a century after the Civil War, something or someone saved his life. Whether Red Tom was a ghost, a guardian, or something else entirely, I can't say. All I know is that without that silent warning, I wouldn't be here today to tell this story. She was a friend of mine during college, someone I knew casually, but well enough that her disappearance shook everyone around us. This happened during our freshman year when everything still felt new and fragile. She was only 18 at the time, still adjusting to college life, still trusting the world more than she probably should have. One weekend, she went to a party at another university about 25 miles north of our school. It wasn't unusual. Students often traveled between campuses for parties, especially on weekends. She didn't go alone. She arrived with another female friend, and I believe that friend was the one driving. It was supposed to be a normal night out, nothing dangerous or unusual. The party itself was large, crowded, loud, and chaotic. The kind of party where people drift in and out of rooms. Conversations overlap, and it's easy to lose track of who you arrived with. At some point during the night, she split off from her friend. She told people she was going to play cornhole or just hang out with another group for a bit. No one thought much of it. That kind of thing happened all the time at college parties. Later in the night, her friend started looking for her. At first, it was casual. She assumed she had wandered outside or was talking to someone else. But as more time passed, concern started to grow. People checked rooms, checked outside, checked cars. Her phone was called again and again. Every call went straight to voicemail. Eventually, panic set in. The police were called. Reports were made. Her family was notified. By the end of the night, it was clear that she was missing. She hadn't left with her friend. She hadn't gone home. No one had seen her leave. She had simply vanished from the party. The days that followed were some of the longest I can remember. Flyers were posted. Social media posts spread. Students talked about it constantly. Everyone replayed the night in their heads, wondering what they had missed, what they could have done differently. Fear hung over the campus like a heavy cloud. 10 days passed. 10 days with no answers. Then finally, she was found. A homeless man discovered her near a bus stop in the city. He saw her crawling toward it, barely able to move, begging for help. She was in horrific condition. She had a broken leg and a broken arm. She was malnourished, dehydrated, and clearly had been through something terrible. The man immediately called the police and stayed with her until help arrived. What she told authorities afterward was worse than anything anyone had imagined. At the party, someone had secretly drugged her drink. She had no memory of exactly when it happened, only that she began to feel disoriented, weak, and unable to think clearly. A group of men noticed her condition and took advantage of it. They led her away from the party and into a vehicle. She was barely aware of where she was going or who they were. She was taken to an apartment. There she was, repeatedly drugged and raped. She was kept in a small room, locked inside between assaults. The rooms had almost nothing in it. No bed, no comfort, just a bucket she was forced to use as a bathroom. Time blurred together. She lost track of days. She didn't know if anyone was looking for her or if she would ever be found. At one point, after being injected with heroin and assaulted again, she managed to do something extraordinary. Despite being injured, terrified, and drugged, she convinced one of the men to let her use the actual bathroom so she could clean herself. She said later that she didn't even know how she found the words or the strength. She just knew it was her chance. The bathroom had a small window facing outside. She waited until the shower was running, the sound masking everything else. Then she forced herself through the window. It was small and awkward, and her injuries made it even harder. She fell from the third story into a large hedge below. The fall injured her further, but it also saved her life. From there, she crawled. She crawled from the apartment complex toward the road. Every movement was agony. Her leg and arm were broken. She was weak and shaking, but she kept going. She reached the road and then the bus stop, where the homeless man saw her. As people noticed her, cars began to stop. Drivers got out to help. Someone called emergency services. The attention made it impossible for her captors to retrieve her. They had lost control of the situation. Police later used surveillance cameras from nearby areas to track down the apartment she had escaped from. 3 men were arrested and charged for the crimes committed against her. The legal process was long and painful. The recovery was even longer. She didn't return to our university right away. It took almost 2 years before she felt able to come back and continue her education. When she did, she was different. Anyone would have been. The lightness she once had was gone, replaced by caution and strength built from survival. She never partied again, not once. She carried a gun everywhere she legally could. She watched her surroundings constantly. She trusted very few people, but she kept moving forward. She graduated. She became a nurse. Somehow, despite everything that had been done to her, she built a life. She carried trauma with her, but she didn't let it destroy her completely. That, more than anything, left an impression on everyone who knew her. For those of us who were there when she disappeared, the story never left us. It became a reminder of how quickly things can change, how fragile safety really is, and how much strength it can take just to survive. She was only 18 years old when it happened, and none of us ever forgot her story. Many years ago, long before smartphones and instant messages became part of everyday life, we relied on much simpler technology to stay in touch. Back then, cell phones were rare, expensive, and not something most people carried around. Instead, we used pagers. They were small devices clipped to your belt or waistband, always buzzing, always demanding attention. Someone would page you with their phone number, and when you found a phone, you would call them back. That was just how things worked. At the time, I was working as an on-call technician in the audio-visual field. My job required me to be available at almost any hour. If something went wrong at a client's site, I was the person they called. Because of that, my pager went off constantly. It was normal for it to buzz multiple times a day, sometimes even in the middle of the night. I was used to it, and most of the time, it didn't bother me much. There was one rule everyone understood when it came to pagers. If a client added 911 after their phone number, it meant the issue was urgent. It meant stop what you're doing and call immediately. A 911 page wasn't something to ignore. That said, I rarely received them. Most problems weren't true emergencies, and clients usually respected that. One afternoon, I was driving from Orlando to St. Petersburg on Interstate 4. It was a familiar drive, one I had made many times before. Traffic was steady but not terrible, and I was just cruising along, thinking about work and what I still needed to get done that day. Then my pager went off. I glanced down and saw a phone number I didn't recognize. Right after it were the numbers 911. That immediately caught my attention. My first reaction was annoyance, mixed with concern. Who was this, and why was it so urgent? I checked the road, found the nearest exit, and decided to pull off right away. Back then, you couldn't just call someone from your car, you had to find a payphone. I exited the highway and found a small truck stop just outside of Plant City. It wasn't busy at all. It looked like the kind of place truckers might stop for coffee or fuel, but at that moment, it felt quiet and almost empty. The whole process from getting the page to pulling into the lot probably took no more than 3 minutes. I parked, walked inside, and asked the girl behind the counter for some change. She handed me a few quarters, and I headed over to the wall where there were 4 payphones lined up side by side. They were the old kind, heavy and scratched, with faded instruction labels and sticky buttons. I chose one, dropped in my quarter, and dialed the number displayed on my pager. It rang, and rang, and rang. I stood there listening, growing more confused by the second. The call just kept ringing, unanswered. I remember thinking how strange it was. Who pages someone with a 911 and then doesn't answer their phone? That made no sense at all. I was just about to hang up when I noticed something odd. There was another ringing sound, separate from the one in my ear. It was faint at first, but once I paid attention, I couldn't ignore it. I pulled the handset away from my ear and listened. 2 phones down from the one I was using, another payphone was ringing. Not an outgoing ring like mine, but an incoming call. Someone was calling that phone right there on the same wall. I hung up my handset, and immediately the ringing on the other phone stopped. That alone was strange enough to make my stomach tighten. Curious and uneasy, I took a few steps over and picked up the ringing phone. As I did, I looked at the phone number printed above its buttons. Then I looked down at my pager, then back at the phone, then back at the pager again. Except for the 911, the numbers were identical. For a moment, I felt like all the air had been knocked out of me. My chest tightened, and I had this strange sensation, like the room had suddenly tilted. I stood there staring at the phone, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't feel real. It felt wrong, like something that shouldn't be possible. I slowly walked back over to the counter and asked the girl if she had seen anyone use the payphones recently. She looked at me like the question surprised her. She told me I was the only person who had been in the store for the last hour. That made it worse. The whole experience probably lasted no more than 15 minutes, but it felt much longer. By the time I walked back out to my car, the hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up. I felt watched, unsettled, and deeply uncomfortable. All I wanted was to get back on the road and put distance between myself and that place. I pulled back onto the highway and drove. About 10 miles down the road, I saw flashing lights ahead. Traffic slowed, and soon I realized why. There had been a serious accident. It looked like a bomb had gone off on the highway. 4 cars were involved in a massive pileup, along with a tractor-trailer hauling steel. The steel had come loose, scattering across the road. State troopers and paramedics were just arriving on the scene. I pulled over to the side and got out to help however I could. There wasn't much to do. The accident had been violent and sudden. By the time emergency services arrived, the worst had already happened. I won't go into graphic detail, but it was clear that lives had been lost or permanently changed in a matter of seconds. As I stood there, helping where I could, and then stepping back to let professionals take over, my mind kept drifting back to that pager, to that phone number, to the ringing payphone. I don't know who sent that page. I don't know why it came when it did. I don't know how a payphone ended up ringing with the same number that had just paged me. especially when no one else had been there, and I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't pulled over when I did. What I do know is this: if I had ignored that page, even for a few minutes, I would have been right there when that accident happened. I would have been driving at full speed into chaos, steel, and wreckage. I think about that often, even now. Sometimes life gives you warnings you don't understand until much later. Sometimes they come in ways that make no sense at all. And sometimes you don't realize how close you came to disaster until you're already past it. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. When my parents were in college, long before they were married or even officially dating, they took a trip down to Florida with a group of friends. They had met through mutual friends back home and were part of the same social circle, but at that point, they hadn't gone on a real date yet. There was interest, but nothing had been defined. Like many college students, they were young, carefree, and enjoying the freedom that came with being away from home. The trip to Florida was supposed to be fun and relaxed. Sun, beaches, cheap motels, and long nights hanging out. My dad went with one of his close friends, and my mom went with a group of her own friends. Even though they were part of the same larger group, they weren't attached at the hip. They made loose plans to meet up when they could. One evening, my dad and his friend were supposed to meet my mom and her friends at a hotel. It was nothing serious, just a casual plan to hang out together for the night. But as college guys often do, they lost track of time. They were talking, joking around, and not paying attention to the clock. By the time they realized how late it was, it became obvious that walking to the hotel would take too long. They stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. This was before ride-sharing apps, before easy access to cell phones, before quick solutions. They didn't have a car, and calling a taxi felt unnecessary and expensive. They were young and thought they could handle themselves. So they made a decision that, at the time, didn't seem like a big deal. They decided to hitchhike. It was something people still did back then, especially college students. It felt risky but not dangerous in the way we think of it now. They stood by the road, stuck out their thumbs, and waited. Before long, a car pulled over. Inside were two women. One was driving and the other sat in the passenger seat. They seemed normal enough. Friendly, casual, not threatening in any obvious way. My dad and his friend climbed into the back seat, grateful for the ride and relieved that they wouldn't miss meeting my mom and her friends. At first, everything felt fine. The conversation was light. Nothing seemed off. The car moved quickly down the road, and my dad remembers thinking that this had worked out better than expected. They were making good time, and it looked like they would reach the hotel without any trouble. Then the driver asked a question. She turned slightly and asked if it was okay to stop for gas. My dad and his friend didn't think anything of it. Of course, it was fine. She was doing them a favor, after all. They agreed without hesitation, and she pulled into a gas station. She got out, filled her car completely with gas, and then jumped back into the driver's seat. That was when everything changed. Instead of calmly pulling away, she floored it. The tires screeched and the car shot forward out of the gas station. It became immediately clear that she had just stolen the gas. My dad and his friend were thrown back in their seats, stunned and confused. They looked at each other, panic starting to rise. They weren't just hitchhikers anymore. They were now unwilling participants in a crime. Their minds raced. Should they say something? Should they ask her to slow down? Should they demand to be let out? Before either of them could say a word, the driver reached down and pulled a gun from under her seat. She didn't turn around fully. She didn't wave it dramatically. She just held it where they could see it and calmly asked something along the lines of, "Are we going to have a problem?" The question hung in the air. My dad later told me that his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. There was no bravado left, no jokes, no confidence, just pure fear. He and his friend shook their heads as fast as they could. No, absolutely not. Whatever she wanted, they were fine with it. What else do you do in that situation? She put the gun away just as casually as she had pulled it out and continued driving like nothing had happened. The rest of the ride was quiet. No one spoke. The mood had completely changed. My dad and his friend sat perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to say the wrong thing, afraid that any small action might set her off. Every mile felt longer than the last. Finally, she pulled up to the hotel where my mom and her friends were staying. She stopped the car and, without another word, told them to get out. My dad and his friend didn't hesitate. They climbed out as quickly as they could, thanked her out of pure instinct, and watched as she drove away. They stood there for a moment shaking, trying to process what had just happened. But they were alive. They weren't hurt. They hadn't been robbed. They hadn't been shot. In the strange logic of young people, they brushed it off as a crazy story and went inside to meet the others. They didn't call the police. They didn't report the gas theft. They didn't talk about the gun. It was easier to treat it like a wild experience and move on. Time passed. The trip ended. They went back to college. Life continued. My parents eventually started dating, then built a life together. That strange hitchhiking incident faded into the background, something my dad remembered but didn't dwell on. Then, not long after, the news started reporting on a serial killer in Florida. The name Aileen Wuornos began appearing everywhere. News stations talked about murdered men, highway shootings, and a woman who targeted people along the roads. Her face was shown repeatedly on television and in newspapers. When my dad saw her picture, something in him froze. He recognized her immediately. He knew without any doubt that she was the woman who had picked them up. The driver, the woman with the gun, the same voice, the same face, the same calm, dangerous presence. The realization hit him hard. The story suddenly changed from a strange, college memory to something much darker. He replayed the entire ride in his head. The gas station, the stolen fuel, the gun, the question, the silence, the drop-off. He realized how close they had come to something far worse. The only reason my dad believes they survived that encounter is because of how they behaved. They were polite, respectful. They didn't flirt. They didn't make jokes. They didn't try to act tough or entitled. They were grateful and non-threatening. Later reports said that her victims were often men who tried to take advantage of her, men who treated her badly or saw her as someone they could control. My dad truly believes that by showing her respect and not pushing boundaries, they didn't trigger whatever switch led her to violence. Looking back, it terrifies him. A simple decision to hitchhike, a few minutes late, one wrong ride, and the outcome could have been completely different. It's strange how life works that way, how close you can come to disaster without ever knowing it in the moment, how one small choice can put you face to face with someone capable of incredible violence. My dad doesn't tell this story lightly. He doesn't dramatize it. He doesn't exaggerate. Every time he talks about it, there's a seriousness in his voice, a quiet awareness of how lucky he was. If things had gone slightly differently, he might not have made it to that hotel. He might not have seen my mom again. He might not have lived the life he eventually built. And the most unsettling part is how normal it all felt at first. Just two college guys, a ride, a casual favor, a few miles down the road. Sometimes danger doesn't announce itself loudly. Sometimes it smiles, offers help, and asks a simple question. And sometimes surviving has nothing to do with strength, and everything to do with being polite, quiet, and lucky enough to be let go. When I was younger, there was one teacher who stayed in my life in a way that still feels strange when I think about it. She was my preschool teacher when I was very little, and then, years later, through a series of job changes and coincidences, she ended up being my English teacher in 11th grade. Most teachers come and go, but she somehow appeared at two completely different stages of my life, and because of that, she always stood out to me. She had lived a life that felt far bigger than the quiet classrooms she taught in. Her family background alone sounded like something out of a novel. Her mother had written a book that was very well known at the time, and her father had worked in a high-level government position. But as interesting as her family was, it wasn't her background that stayed with students the most. It was a story she told every single year without fail. Before I tell that story, there's something important about how she looked. She had dark hair and striking blue eyes. At first, that detail doesn't seem important, but it becomes very important later. She was calm, well-spoken, and serious in a quiet way. When she told stories, she didn't exaggerate or dramatize. She spoke plainly, like someone who didn't need to convince you, because she knew the truth was enough. Every year, at some point during the school term, she would tell her students this story. Not as entertainment, not to scare anyone for fun, but as a reminder, a warning. She always said it happened when she was much younger, long before she became a teacher. She said that at the time, she and her boyfriend were taking a long drive through Arizona. For people who have never been there, it's hard to understand just how empty some parts of that state can feel. There are stretches of road that go on for miles with nothing around. No houses, no stores, no people, just desert, heat, and silence. She was driving her car, and her boyfriend was following behind her on his motorcycle. They weren't racing or fooling around. They were simply traveling together. They both knew where they were going by memory, so they weren't worried about staying right next to each other the entire time. Over the course of the drive, they slowly became separated by a few miles. She said she was comfortable driving alone. She wasn't scared. It was daytime. The road was a two-way highway, but traffic was light. Everything felt normal. At some point, she noticed a car behind her. It was a Volkswagen Beetle. At first, she didn't think anything of it. Cars pass each other all the time, especially on long drives. But then the driver pulled into the opposite lane, even though there was no oncoming traffic, and began motioning at her. He was signaling for her to pull over. She ignored him at first. She said most people would. You don't just pull over because a stranger waves at you on an empty road. But the man didn't stop. He kept pulling up beside her, gesturing more urgently, each time. His movements became more frantic. He looked agitated. She began to think that maybe he had seen something wrong with her car, a flat tire, a broken light, something dangerous. The way he kept insisting made her believe he might actually be trying to help. Eventually, she saw a small parking lot coming up on the side of the road. It belonged to a gas station, but it was deserted. No cars, no people. The building looked closed. Still, it felt like a safer place to pull over than the side of the highway. She turned into the parking lot and stopped her car. The moment she did, she said a feeling washed over her that she couldn't explain. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something colder. A deep sense that something was wrong. The kind of feeling that makes your stomach tighten without knowing why. The man pulled in behind her. He got out of his car and walked toward her. She said there was something about him that immediately made her uneasy. The way he stood, the way he spoke, the way his eyes stayed on her. He told her that something was wrong with her headlight. He insisted that she needed to get out of the car so he could show her. She hesitated. Every instinct she had told her not to leave her car. The feeling she had only grew stronger. She said that looking back, she realized how close she was to ignoring that instinct because she didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. She cracked the door but didn't fully step out right away. The man kept pushing. He kept insisting. He told her she had to come look. He said it was important. Meanwhile, her boyfriend was still riding behind her, closing the distance. He had noticed she was no longer ahead of him and began to worry. As he came over a rise in the road, he saw her car pulled over at the deserted gas station. He immediately turned in. At the exact moment she finally stepped out of her car, her boyfriend's motorcycle pulled into the parking lot. Everything changed instantly. The man's entire demeanor shifted. Without saying a word, he turned around, got back into his Volkswagen Beetle, and sped away so fast it looked like he was running for his life. Tires kicked up dust as he disappeared back onto the highway. Her boyfriend jumped off his motorcycle and ran to her. He asked if she was okay. She was shaking. She told him what had just happened. They both stood there in silence for a moment, letting it sink in. At the time they were shaken, but they didn't fully understand how close she had come to something terrible. They talked about it, but eventually life moved on. The drive continued. The incident became something strange and unsettling, but not yet horrifying. That came later. Sometime after that trip, news reports began circulating about a serial killer. His face was everywhere. His name was Ted Bundy. He was being connected to the disappearances and murders of young women across multiple states. When she saw his picture, her blood ran cold. She recognized him immediately. The dark hair, the eyes, the face, the calm, almost friendly appearance that hid something deeply wrong. She knew without a doubt that he was the man who had pulled her over in the desert. She said that realization hit her harder than anything else in her life. She replayed the moment again and again in her mind. The deserted gas station, the insistence, the way he wanted her out of the car, the way he fled the second another man appeared. She told her students every year that she truly believed she would not be alive if her boyfriend had been even 3 miles farther behind her. 3 miles, a distance so small it feels meaningless until you realize it can be the difference between life and death. She never told the story in a dramatic way. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stated the facts and let them sit in the room. You could feel the silence afterward. Every student understood that this wasn't a scary story meant for fun. This was real. She always ended the story with the same message. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Politeness is not worth your safety. You do not owe strangers your time, your attention, or your trust. That story stayed with me long after I left her class. Even now, years later, I think about it when I'm driving alone, or when someone tries to get my attention in a place that feels unsafe. I think about how easily things can turn dark, how quickly normal moments can become dangerous. She went on to live a full life. She became a teacher who impacted countless students. She survived something most people never even come close to, and she made sure that her experience didn't go to waste by using it to warn others. What makes the story truly terrifying isn't just who the man was. It's how ordinary it all felt at the time. A road trip, a stranger offering help, a moment of hesitation. Sometimes danger doesn't look like danger at all. Sometimes it looks like a man in a small car, waving you over on a quiet road, pretending to be helpful. And sometimes survival comes down to timing, instinct, and the sudden appearance of someone who wasn't supposed to be there yet. A while back, a group of girls from my friend circle decided to go out for a night together. They wanted to dance, drink a little, and just let loose after a long week. They ended up going to a local gay club, which was known as a generally safe place, especially for women. It was the kind of spot where people felt comfortable being themselves, where aggressive behavior usually wasn't tolerated, and where the atmosphere felt more protective than most regular clubs. For some reason, I didn't go with them that night. I honestly don't even remember why anymore. At the time, it probably felt like no big deal. Looking back now, I have mixed feelings about it. Part of me is relieved I wasn't there because what happened was terrifying. Another part of me wishes I had been there because maybe I could have helped, or at least shared the responsibility of stepping in. That night, while my friends were on the dance floor, they noticed something that immediately felt wrong. There was a girl dancing, or at least standing in the middle of the crowd, who looked completely out of place. She wasn't dressed like anyone else there. Instead of club clothes, she was wearing sweatpants and a plain t-shirt. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail. On top of all that, she had a backpack on her shoulders. That alone would have stood out anywhere, but especially in a club. People usually plan their outfits carefully when they go out. They dress to feel confident, attractive, or expressive. This girl looked like she had walked in straight from running errands or heading to class, not like someone who had planned a night of dancing, but her clothes weren't the most concerning thing. My friends said she looked completely dazed. Her eyes were unfocused. She wasn't really moving to the music. She wasn't smiling, laughing, or engaging with anyone around her. She just stood there, almost swaying, like she was barely aware of where she was. And there was a man with her. He was very large, much bigger than her, and he had his hands all over her. He was grabbing her and grinding against her aggressively. What made it worse was that she wasn't responding at all. She wasn't pushing him away, but she also wasn't participating. She just stood there, letting it happen, like she didn't have the energy or awareness to react. That set off alarm bells immediately. One of my friends decided to approach her. She tried to be casual and friendly, moving close and asking if she was okay. Before the girl could even respond, the man stepped in and answered for her. He said very firmly that the girl was his girlfriend. He claimed she had just had too much to drink and that she was fine. Something about the way he said it made everyone uneasy. He was defensive, too quick, too controlling. He didn't let the girl speak at all. He positioned himself between them, like he was guarding her. My friends backed off for the moment. They didn't want to cause a scene or make things worse if they were wrong. But none of them believed his explanation. The situation didn't sit right with any of them, so they decided to keep watching. They stayed nearby, keeping the man and the girl in their line of sight. They watched how he interacted with her. He guided her by the arm. He whispered things in her ear. She barely reacted to anything. She looked less drunk and more empty. Eventually, the man left the dance floor and went toward the bar. That was the opening my friends needed. One of them immediately went back to the girl and tried again to talk to her. This time, without the man hovering over her, they were able to get a clearer picture of what was going on. The girl was barely coherent. She struggled to focus on the conversation. Her words were slow and slurred, but not in a way that matched typical drunkenness. She seemed confused about where she was and how long she had been there. My friend said it felt much more like she had been drugged than just drinking too much. With effort, the girl managed to communicate a few terrifying things. She said she didn't know the man. She said she didn't come to the club with him. And she said she wanted to leave. That was all my friend needed to hear. She grabbed the girl's hand, wrapped an arm around her, and started heading for the exit. The plan was simple. Get out of the club. Get somewhere safe, figure everything else out later. But they didn't make it far. The man came back from the bar and immediately realized what was happening. The second he saw my friend trying to lead the girl away, he exploded. His entire demeanor changed. He rushed toward them, got right in my friend's face, and started screaming at her. He accused her of kidnapping. He yelled that the girl was his girlfriend. He demanded she let go of her immediately. My friend tried to stay calm, but the situation escalated fast. The man got closer. His face was inches from hers. He was spitting as he yelled. People around them started to notice, but no one immediately stepped in. The noise, the music, the chaos of the club made everything feel unreal and out of control. Then he swung at her. It happened so fast that she barely had time to react. She managed to dodge the punch by inches. If she hadn't moved when she did, he would have hit her square in the face. At that point, everything felt like it could go horribly wrong. Thankfully, someone else had already gone to get security. A guard arrived just in time to intervene before the man could hurt anyone. The guard stepped between them and forced the man back. Other staff members came over. The man was restrained and removed from the immediate area. That intervention likely prevented serious injuries or worse. With the man distracted and contained, my friends took the opportunity to leave immediately. They got the girl out of the club and into fresh air as fast as they could. She was still extremely out of it. She could barely walk on her own. They supported her, helped her into a car, and got her away from that place. Outside the club, they tried to get more information from her, but it was difficult. She was still heavily impaired. She couldn't clearly explain what had happened to her earlier in the day, or how she ended up at the club with that man. One thing she did manage to say, though, made the situation even scarier. She said the man had been following her around town all day, not just at the club, all day. That realization made everything worse. It meant this wasn't random, it wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't a drunken hookup gone wrong. This man had likely targeted her, followed her, and waited for an opportunity to isolate and control her. The night eventually ended with my friends making sure the girl was safe and with people she trusted. But the fear didn't go away. What makes the entire situation even more unsettling is what happened afterward. Once my friends left with the girl, the bar staff couldn't actually do much else. Since the girl was gone and hadn't personally reported anything at that moment, all they could legally do was throw the man out of the club. They banned him from the premises, but that was it. One of my friends did call the police and gave them a description of the man. The response was frustrating and deeply unsettling. The police said there wasn't much they could do without a formal complaint from the victim. They said they would be on the lookout, but there was no immediate action they could take, so that was it. The man was removed from the club, and then he was back out on the street. The thought of that still makes my stomach turn. The idea that someone could act that aggressively, that suspiciously, and still walk away with no real consequences is terrifying. There was no guarantee he wouldn't do it again. No guarantee he wouldn't follow another woman. No guarantee he wouldn't succeed next time. That's the part that sticks with me the most. Not just what happened, but how close it came to being so much worse. How easily the situation could have ended differently if my friends hadn't trusted their instincts, if they had decided it wasn't their place to interfere, if they had believed the man's lie and walked away. It's terrifying to think about how many situations like this might go unnoticed. How many times people look the other way because they don't want to cause trouble. How many predators rely on that hesitation. That night reinforced something important for all of us. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If someone looks like they need help, they probably do. And sometimes stepping in, even when it's uncomfortable or scary, can be the difference between someone getting home safely and something far worse happening. The scariest part is knowing that man is likely still out there somewhere, and knowing that without people willing to step in, he may try again. This happened about 9 years ago, and even now when I think about it, the memory sits heavy in my chest. It isn't the kind of story that fades with time. If anything, it has only grown stranger the more distance I've put between myself and it. At the time, I was working as an underground engineer at a massive mining site. When I say underground, I don't mean a few tunnels or a small operation beneath the surface. I mean miles down, so far beneath the earth that the surface felt like a myth more than a place. I worked with enormous machinery, systems so large and complex that a single mistake could cost lives. My specific responsibility was maintaining a large industrial boiler. There wasn't just one boiler. There were more than a dozen of them, each towering roughly 30 feet high, thick metal giants that ran non-stop, day and night. Each boiler had a small team of engineers assigned to it, working in shifts to make sure it never stopped running. These boilers were the heart of everything. They didn't just power the mining shafts. They powered an entire city that existed underground. A real city. Streets, buildings, schools, shops, government offices, homes. A place where tens of thousands of people lived full lives without ever seeing the sky. We're talking about roughly 20,000 people, depending on those systems every single moment. The boilers broke down constantly. They were pushed beyond what they were ever designed to handle. Makeshift repairs were routine. You didn't replace parts the way you would in a normal facility. You reinforced, reshaped, welded, improvised. You learned every sound, every vibration, every slight change in pressure that might mean something was about to fail. If more than 4 boilers went down at the same time, power to the residential sectors would be cut to keep the industrial sector alive. That was always the priority. If the industrial sector lost power, the air circulation systems would fail. The pumps that brought breathable air through the city would stop. And if that happened, people didn't just lose electricity. They suffocated. Everyone knew this. It wasn't hidden. It was just a fact of life. No one had been to the surface in decades. There had been some kind of pestilence, some kind of ongoing danger, though even that felt vague in my memory, like a threat everyone accepted but rarely spoke about in detail. Whatever was up there, it was worse than staying below. This was a fully self-contained world. There were politicians who governed the city, teachers who taught children, service workers who cleaned streets and repaired homes, weavers who made clothing, cooks who fed thousands every day, doctors, mechanics. Everyone had a role. Everyone worked. That was how survival functioned. I had a family. My wife worked at the school. She taught children, including our own. We had 3 kids. Our oldest, Robert, was 13 at the time. In 3 years, he would turn 16, which meant he would leave school and start working, just like everyone else. The other 2 were younger, still small enough to cling to stuffed animals and fall asleep wherever they sat. I can still remember them clearly. I remember our house. It wasn't large, but it was comfortable. I can picture the layout perfectly, the way the furniture was arranged, the little decorations my wife liked to collect, the small imperfections in the walls, the children's blankets, their teddies, their beds. I remember the way the lighting cast long shadows down the street outside. I remember neighbors, faces, names, personalities. I remember arguments, friendships, shared meals, small celebrations. I remember walking through the city and recognizing hundreds of people, knowing where they worked, who they lived with, what kind of person they were. At the time, I was in my mid-30s. I wasn't new to this world. I had decades of memories built inside it, years of routine, years of responsibility, years of love, stress, exhaustion, pride. It felt like a complete, fully lived life. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. I woke up. I put that word in quotes because I was already awake, or at least it felt that way. But something was wrong immediately. The first thing I noticed was the light. It was bright, blinding, white, nothing like the orange sodium lamps that lit the underground city. That alone made my head spin. I was confused, disoriented. My body felt weak, heavy, unfamiliar. There were faces around me, people talking, asking questions. I recognized some of them, or at least my brain thought it did, but the recognition didn't connect to anything solid. It was like knowing a word but forgetting its meaning. I tried to understand where I was. I tried to remember how I got there. My thoughts felt scrambled, like they were sliding off each other before I could grab onto them. Slowly, reality began to push its way in. I was in a hospital. I had contracted a serious bacterial infection. I'd been running a dangerously high fever. I had been unconscious for several days. No more than 4, according to the doctors. 4 days. That was all. In those 4 days, my brain had created an entire world. A city, a career, a wife, children, friends. Decades of memories layered on top of each other with incredible detail and emotional weight. None of it was real. I tried to talk about it. I told my girlfriend at the time what I had experienced, what I remembered. She listened, but her focus was understandably on how close I had come to something far worse. How serious my condition had been. How lucky I was to be alive. After that, I stopped talking about it. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. How do you explain that you miss people who never existed? That you feel grief for children who were never born? That you remember a home that was never built? This wasn't like a typical hallucination. It wasn't random images or nonsense. I wasn't seeing impossible creatures or warped reality. This was structured, logical, consistent. It followed rules. Cause and effect existed. Time passed. People aged. Systems broke and were repaired. I had memories stretching back nearly 30 years inside my head, and yet none of it had happened. That realization broke something in me. For a long time afterward, I fell into a deep depression. I felt hollow, detached. I would look at real people and feel distant, as if they were less solid than the ones I remembered from the underground city. I felt like I had lost something precious and irreplaceable, even though I knew, logically, that it had never truly existed. I left out many details when I first tried to tell this story. I still do. Even now, writing this, there are moments I hesitate. Certain memories still feel too heavy, too intimate, too painful to fully describe. 9 years later, they still make me feel somber, reflective, unsettled. What scared me the most wasn't the illness. It was what my brain was capable of. The fact that my mind could generate something so detailed, so emotionally rich, so convincing, without any external input. That it could make me love people who weren't real. That it could make me feel responsibility, fear, pride, and grief for a world that existed only inside my head. Sometimes, even now, I'll catch myself remembering a face, a street, a sound from that underground city, and for a split second, it feels real again. And then the weight of knowing it settles back in. It changed how I think about reality. It made me question how fragile our sense of self really is, how thin the line is between what we experience and what we believe to be true. It made me realize that memory doesn't care whether something actually happened. If it feels real enough, it becomes part of you anyway. That's the part that still scares me. Not that my brain lied to me, but that it did such a perfect job of it. This happened a few years ago, but even now, thinking about it still sends a cold feeling down my spine. It's one of those moments where everything seems small and ordinary at first, and then later you realize how close things came to going very wrong. At the time, my wife was staying at her parents' house. She wasn't living there by choice or convenience, but because her father was dealing with serious health issues. The kind of issues that change daily routines, bring stress into the home, and make everyone more alert but also more tired than usual. She spent a lot of time going back and forth, helping where she could, trying to be present for her family. That evening, she arrived at the house, like she had many times before. It was already dark outside, but nothing felt unusual. The neighborhood was a quiet, residential area, the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where doors are usually locked out of habit, not fear, a place that feels safe. She unlocked the front door and went inside. At the time, no one else was home. Her parents were out, and the house was empty except for the pets. Instead of walking deeper into the house, she stopped in the first room just off the entrance. It was a small room that held the family computers, basically a little office space right near the front door. She set her things down, sat at the computer, and started browsing the internet. Nothing urgent, nothing stressful, just killing time, decompressing a little after the drive. A few minutes later, one of the cats came into the room. Not just any cat, her cat. This cat had been with her for years. He was older, calm, and almost impossibly gentle. He was the kind of cat people joked about not having a survival instinct. He loved everyone, strangers, kids, other animals. It didn't matter. He never hissed, never growled, never showed aggression. There was a running joke in the family about how relaxed he was. You could pick him up at any time, disturb him while he slept, or move him from place to place, and he would barely react. He was the type of cat who would lie in the yard while squirrels threw pecans at him from the trees, and he wouldn't even flinch. Just blink slowly and continue existing. That was the cat my wife knew. But that night, the cat that walked into the room was not behaving like himself. He didn't come over for attention. He didn't rub against her legs. He didn't jump onto a chair or desk. Instead, he stopped in the doorway that led from the computer room into the rest of the house. And he stood there. At first, my wife didn't think much of it. She noticed him out of the corner of her eye, but she was focused on the screen. Then she heard it. A low growl. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A sound she had never heard from him before. She turned in her chair to look at him more closely. The cat was standing stiff, body tense, fur slightly raised. He was facing into the house, not toward her. Every few seconds, he would growl again. Then hiss, not constantly, but in short bursts like warnings. He was positioned directly between her and the entrance to the rest of the house. That alone made her uneasy. She spoke to him softly, trying to calm him, called his name. Usually, that would have been enough for him to relax or come over to her. This time, he didn't move. He didn't even look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the dark hallway beyond the doorway. Then he growled again, deeper this time. The longer it went on, the more wrong it felt. This wasn't playful. This wasn't random. This was defensive, protective, like he was guarding her from something she couldn't see. My wife later told me that every instinct in her body started screaming that something was not right. She didn't hear noises. She didn't see movement. But the way the cat was acting made her skin crawl. This was an animal that never reacted to anything, and now he looked like he was ready to attack. She stood up slowly, keeping her eyes on him. The cat didn't back away. If anything, he seemed more focused, more alert. His body language was clear. Whatever he sensed, it was serious. That was the moment she decided she wasn't staying. She walked over, gently picked him up, and held him close. He didn't fight her. He didn't calm down either. He stayed tense in her arms, still staring toward the rest of the house, still growling under his breath. She didn't go any farther inside. She walked straight back out the front door and left the house. Once outside, she moved away from the entrance and stood on the front walkway, trying to steady her breathing. Her heart was pounding. She felt foolish for being scared, but also terrified that she might be ignoring something important. As she stood there, a patrol car drove slowly down the street. That alone was unusual. This wasn't an area where police cars regularly patrolled at night. It wasn't a high-crime neighborhood. Seeing flashing lights or cruisers was rare enough that people noticed when it happened. Without thinking too much about it, she waved them down. The officer stopped, rolled down the window, and asked if everything was okay. She explained what had just happened, that she had just arrived home, that no one else was supposed to be there, and that her normally calm cat was acting extremely aggressive, like he was guarding her from something inside the house. The officers exchanged a look. They didn't laugh. They didn't brush it off. Their tone changed immediately. They told her to get into the back of the cruiser and stay there. Not asked, told. They said they would check the house. She sat in the car, clutching her cat, watching as the two officers approached the house cautiously. They drew their weapons before entering. That alone made her stomach drop. A few minutes passed, then more. Time stretched in that awful way where every second feels heavy. She watched the front door, listened for raised voices, for shouting, for anything. Eventually, one of the officers came back outside. The look on his face confirmed that something had been very wrong. They told her that the back door of the house had been wide open, not unlocked. Open. This was deeply disturbing for one simple reason. Her parents were obsessive about locking doors. My wife was too. They never left doors unlocked, especially not open, ever. It wasn't a habit, it wasn't forgetfulness, it was a rule. The officers searched the house thoroughly. No one was inside by the time they arrived. Whoever had been there was gone. Later, after everything had settled a bit, the officers told her something else, something they hadn't said at first. They were actively searching the area for a serial rapist. There had been reports, sightings, enough concern that patrols had been increased, even in normally safe neighborhoods. That was why the cruiser had been driving slowly down her street that night. Hearing that made her feel sick. The realization hit all at once. Someone had likely been inside the house, someone dangerous, someone who might have heard her enter, someone who might have been moving through the house when she stopped in that first room. And the only reason she hadn't walked farther inside was because her cat had stopped her. The cat had sensed something before she ever did. If she had gone deeper into the house, if she had followed her normal routine, if she had ignored the cat's behavior, things could have gone very differently. That thought still makes my chest tighten. The officers advised her not to stay there that night. Arrangements were made. The back door was secured. The house was checked again. But the feeling of safety was gone. Even now, years later, we talk about it sometimes, about how close that moment was to becoming something much worse, about how instincts don't always come from our own minds. Sometimes they come from animals. Sometimes they come from a quiet warning that doesn't make logical sense in the moment. Her cat went back to being his usual calm, gentle self afterward. Never acted like that again. Never growled or hissed the same way. But that night, he knew. And because of him, my wife walked away unharmed. If there's one lesson to take from all of this, it's simple. Always trust the cat. My brother would get really bad night terrors in the house he was born in, and they were nothing like normal nightmares. From the time he was very young, there were nights when he would suddenly start screaming in a way that didn't sound human. It wasn't just fear, it sounded like pain. When my parents rushed into the room, he would be sitting up in bed with his eyes open, breathing fast, his face twisted in terror. The scariest part was that he looked awake, but he wasn't really there. No matter how much they called his name or tried to shake him, he couldn't respond. These episodes happened often, sometimes several times a week. During them, he would act like he was trapped inside something terrible that only he could see or feel. He would scream about being hurt, about someone attacking him, about unbearable pain. One time he woke up crying and clutching his hands, insisting that a man had crushed his fingers in a drawer. He screamed that he could still feel it, even though there was no mark, no injury, nothing that explained the pain he described. He cried for hours afterward, shaking and refusing to sleep again. I shared a room with him, so I saw and heard everything. I remember lying in my bed, frozen, listening to his screams in the dark. Sometimes I was too scared to move. Other times I pulled the blanket over my head and prayed it would stop. There were nights when I pretended to be asleep, even though I was wide awake, afraid that whatever was hurting him might notice me, too. What made it even worse was that sometimes he didn't just talk about pain. Sometimes he talked about seeing things. He would point to corners of the room or stare at empty space near the door and say there was an old man standing there. He described the man in detail. He said the man watched us. He said the man would come closer when the lights were off. I never saw anything myself, but the way my brother spoke about it was calm and certain, not like a child making things up. My parents were terrified and exhausted. They took him to doctors, specialists, and therapists. He went through tests and evaluations. The doctors said they were night terrors, maybe caused by stress, imagination, or an overactive mind. But they couldn't explain why they were so intense, so violent, or why he could describe pain that felt so real. No medication helped. No routine fixed it, nothing changed. As time passed, my mother became convinced there was something wrong with the house itself. It was the house my brother was born in, an older place with creaky floors and strange cold spots. At night, it always felt heavier somehow. Even during the day, there were rooms that felt uncomfortable to sit in for too long. Things would go missing and show up later in strange places. Doors sometimes felt like they were being watched. Eventually, my mom decided to get outside help. She contacted someone who claimed to read spirits or sense energy. I remember thinking it sounded strange, but my mom was desperate. When the woman came to the house, she walked through each room slowly and quietly. She said the house carried something dark, something old. She said there was a presence attached to the place, not to any one person, and that children were more sensitive to it. She told my mom that my brother wasn't imagining things. According to her, the house was haunted. That word stayed with me, haunted. We didn't move right away. Life got in the way, and my parents tried to cope as best they could. My brother's night terrors continued. I learned to sleep lightly, always listening. My parents learned how to calm him down when he came out of an episode, holding him until he stopped shaking. Every night felt like waiting for something terrible to happen. 2 years ago, we finally moved out of that house. The change was immediate. From the first night in the new place, my brother slept quietly. No screaming, no crying, no talking about pain or old men in the room. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Not a single night terror, not one. At first, we thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he had grown out of it. Maybe the doctors had been right all along. But as more time passed, it became impossible to ignore. Years of constant terror had stopped the moment we left that house. Even now, he has not had a single episode. Looking back, the truth feels unsettling but clear. Whatever was causing those night terrors was tied to that place. Not stress, not imagination, not illness. The house itself had something in it. Something that affected him in ways no doctor could explain. I still think about those nights. I still remember the sound of his screams, the way the room felt when the lights were off, and the fear that settled deep into my chest. We left the house behind, but the memories never fully went away. Some places hold on to things, and sometimes the only way to escape them is to leave. The rain arrived heavier than any of them expected. At first, they tried to keep moving along the narrow mountain trail, telling themselves it would ease up soon. But the storm only grew stronger, soaking through their jackets, their backpacks, and finally their sleeping bags. Water ran in cold sheets down their faces. The trail turned to mud beneath their boots. Their phones died one by one until nobody could even check the time, let alone their location. After a while, it became hard to tell how long they had been walking, and nobody could remember the last time they had seen another hiker. It felt as if the mountain had swallowed them whole. When the wind picked up, one of them suggested leaving the trail and taking shelter in the woods. The others agreed without argument. They pushed through the crowded trees, slipping between wet branches until they spotted a shape in the distance, a structure. It was the faintest outline of a house, almost hidden by the thick forest. At first it looked like part of the landscape, something old that the mountain itself was slowly reclaiming. But as they got closer, they could see the corners, the sagging boards, the broken roofline. It was definitely a house, abandoned, decayed, but still standing. A relief rushed through the group. Any shelter was better than none. The roof had collapsed on one side, letting the storm pour straight into whatever had once been a bedroom. But the other half of the house seemed intact. The windows were dark and hollow like empty eyes, but the walls were solid enough. It didn't matter that the place looked forgotten. They needed to get out of the rain, and they needed it now. They pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The change was immediate. No more rain hammering their shoulders, no more wind slicing at their skin. The air inside was cool and still. Dust hung in the darkness like a soft fog. It was so quiet that at first none of them wanted to speak. The entire house felt paused, as if it had been waiting for years for someone to come through the door again. One of them finally muttered, "At least it's dry." The others nodded and set their dripping gear down. They took a moment to breathe, then looked around. The living room still held the outline of an old couch frame, long since torn apart by weather and animals. A few boards of the floor creaked under their weight, but nothing collapsed. For a place that must have sat alone for decades, it held together better than expected. They lit emergency candles, their tiny flames flickering against the peeling walls. The room filled with soft, warm light, and for a moment the tension in their shoulders eased. They unrolled their wet sleeping bags in a rough circle, planning to dry them as much as possible before trying to rest. No one felt truly calm, but they were exhausted enough that comfort mattered less than survival. After a few minutes, one of them wandered off, carrying his candle toward the hallway. The corridor was narrow and lined with doors, each one slightly crooked on its hinges. He tapped on a few of them, trying to guess what the rooms behind them once looked like. Most of them opened without trouble, revealing empty closets or dust-covered floors. Then he came to a door that wouldn't move. He pushed the knob again. Nothing. The door wasn't locked. It just seemed stuck. The wood had swollen from decades of humidity, wedging itself tightly into the frame. He leaned his shoulder into it, grunting softly, but it refused to budge. There was a small gap along one side where the wood had cracked, narrow but just enough to see through. Curious and half bored, he lowered himself, pressed his face close to the frame, and put one eye to the crack. At first he saw nothing, just darkness. But as his eye adjusted, a shape slowly formed. Not a shape, a color. Red, a deep, thick, crimson glow spreading across his whole vision. Not a line or a patch, but a complete wash of red filling everything from edge to edge. He blinked a few times, thinking maybe the candlelight was playing tricks on him, but the red stayed where it was, full, heavy, unmoving. Without saying anything, he backed away and called for the others. They came over, curious about what he'd found. One by one, they lowered themselves to the floor. One by one, they pressed their faces to the crack. and one by one they saw the same thing. Red. Only red. Nothing else. Someone whispered, "Everything's just red." Another shrugged. Maybe the room was painted that way. Could have been a photography darkroom. They tried to explain it in soft, tired voices. Old paint, maybe. A trick of the light. Mineral stains. Anything that made even a little sense. But the more they talked about it, the stranger it felt. The house didn't seem like the sort of place that would have a dark room. And the color they saw, none of them could describe it exactly. It didn't look like paint. It didn't look like light. It didn't feel like it belonged to the room at all. Still, nothing about the house seemed dangerous. So after their brief curiosity faded, they returned to the living room. They were too worn out to worry about mysterious colors behind stuck doors. They were cold, damp, and drained. Whatever was behind that door could be ignored until morning. They laid out their sleeping bags, some still dripping rainwater, and stretched out on the uneven floor. The storm outside roared through the forest, shaking branches and sending gusts against the house. But inside, it remained silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every breath seem louder than it should be. None of them slept well. Some of them didn't sleep at all, drifting in and out of uneasy dreams. Each time they opened their eyes, the flickering candlelight made the shadows crawl along the walls like slow-moving hands. When morning finally broke, pale sunlight leaked through the broken windows. The storm had passed. The air smelled clean and fresh, carrying a hint of pine and wet soil. They packed up quickly, none of them wanting to stay any longer than necessary. Something about the house felt different in the daylight, emptier, colder. Nobody spoke about the red room. They told themselves it had been nothing, and somehow that was enough. By the time they reached the main trail again, the house felt like a strange memory they weren't sure they had experienced at all. They reached the town by late morning, a small, quiet place with a single diner that looked like it had been there for decades. The moment they stepped inside, the familiar warmth of greasy food and fresh coffee wrapped around them, the clatter of dishes, the soft hum of conversation, the smell of toast. It was everything they needed after a long night. They slid into a booth and ordered breakfast. The waitress brought water and hot coffee, smiling the way small-town servers often do when strangers wander in. She asked if they had been camping and how badly the storm had treated them. "We stayed in an old house on the mountain," one of them answered. "Abandoned place not too far from here." The reaction was immediate. The entire diner went silent. Forks stopped midair. Conversations cut off without finishing their sentences. Even the music playing quietly in the background seemed to fade. The waitress froze, the coffee pot hovering just above one of their cups. Her smile thinned. Her eyes widened only a fraction, but it was enough to show she wasn't comfortable anymore. The owner, an older man with a heavy build and a gray beard, looked up from behind the counter. He walked over slowly, wiping his hands on a towel, his expression controlled and careful. "The house in the forest?" he asked. They nodded. "We just waited out the storm," someone said. "You went inside?" "Yeah, there was this room. The door was stuck. We looked through the crack. Everything inside looked completely red." The silence deepened even more, settling over the diner like a heavy blanket. The waitress set the coffee pot down without pouring. She whispered barely loud enough to hear, "You looked into the room." The owner pulled out a chair and sat across from them. His eyes swept over each of their faces as if checking for something he wasn't sure he wanted to find. He folded his hands on the table and took a long breath before speaking. "There's a story people tell about that place," he said slowly. "Nobody knows how much of it is true, but the people who lived there a long time ago. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you. They stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments. And in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.